Remember. So yeah, historical trauma is something that in different ways has surfaced in the class already. And so it's not that it wasn't important or applicable before now, but it's important for me to kind of give you guys some working tools around historical trauma as a phenomenon and how it is both a byproduct, but now also an additive factor in itself when it comes to some of the outcomes that we've described in class or outcomes in communities that are similar to the reservation. In my expertise, trauma, either historical or present day, kind of in your own individual life, this isn't really the realm of sociologists. We typically kind of point our lens elsewhere to outside the individual. And I think that to focus on trauma is not to not do that, but to instead ask the question, is there an equal exposure to trauma in the life course for all people? Or like other outcomes, do we see some kind of disproportionate experience shaped by the boundaries and the axes of meanings that have mattered up until now? Historical trauma in and of itself is now something that I would say when people talk about something called reverse causality, it's kind of like, if we were to find some way to like bring back jobs, bring back the buffalo, bring back all the things that we once had, would the things we have now, would it all go away? I mean, that'd be pretty nice. Let's give it a try. But arguably, this has become something that's self-sustaining and is kind of like a snowball or shit rolling downhill. It just gets bigger with time. It's not something that's unique to Indigenous communities by a long shot. And so that's kind of why it's important for today to have a content warning across the board, is that this could be something that is relevant for you, but no matter what, why is what I go by in my grad students class. And that's applicable, I think, with this issue, that the more you know about it, if it is applicable to you, it can be helpful. There's some things I wish I had known once upon a time. And this is some of that. Now, we are going to pause for attendance because I want to bust it out. I have some announcements. I've had some cool emails. I just have a backlog. You guys know me. I'm hoping to purge today. And so if you are expecting an update on the missing and murdered quiz from last week, you'll be seeing that. You guys are got quick eyes. And so I want to tell you two things. Attendance is wiggly, as you can see here. There's been times where I'm like, we're late. We're all here. Those are days where I have to go in and input everyone being present. Just haven't gone and done that. Some of you are concerned that your attendance grade has kind of fluctuated a little, or that you were marked late last week. I love that you knew and noticed that, but that was simply a mechanism for me to indicate who needed to do the quiz, but was not actually absent, if that makes sense. Because there was a handful of people who just weren't here, so they get the red X, and then there's like a in-between designation, which is late. So if you're like, I wasn't late, I was here, I was listening to her talk the whole time. I know that. And that will be amended to present once I stop using it as a proxy for the MMIP exam, or quiz, excuse me, 5 points. Now, what other housekeeping? I think that's the biggie. We also were working on grading ongoing. We had about 2 waves of submissions, I would say. So we're hoping to have those back to you guys probably in the next week or two. We might do some time in class kind of talking about common themes, but overall it's been a really good kind of submission experience. But if you're someone who hasn't turned one in yet and I don't know that, or maybe I just haven't replied to the email, whatever it is, don't drop off the grid. Keep in touch. We always work with students. And the closer we get to the end of the semester, I don't want you to crowd that assignment. So let's just get that in sooner than later, but we're almost there. Now let's go through attendance real quick. Remember initial of your last name and then your name. We'll start right in the back in the middle. I'm making eye contact with you. Go ahead. G. Yes, Rena, thank you. Yes. Also, before I lose my thought, I do have to have my phone on today because little Pepino is getting his big boy surgery. So Lord forbid we get an update during class. But I was like, gosh, I'm getting updates as I do this. I'm like, why is my phone bugging me? All right. And Virginia. And thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And Christian.
Yeah. Perfect. We'll go this way. Perfect. Yes. Nice.
And Leah?
Yeah. There we go. Okay, we're gonna toss it back. Go ahead. Last initial, remind me. And. There, thank you. Thank you. You. Nice. Fine, Rebecca. Thank you.
Hey, Brandon.
Awesome.
Hey, Jackie.
Thank you. Excellent. Perfect. And then if you're on Zoom, go ahead and give me a second to put you guys in here. Mhm. Alrighty, we've almost got everyone on Zoom. There it is. Oop. Almost. God, it's so quiet. Okay. E. G. We got all kinds of Zoom peeps today. Did I see a hand? Oh, okay, my bad. Now, yeah, back to announcements for the good of the group. Is there anything else on the subject of the election, or is there any stress relief going on campus? Sometimes they offer kittens somewhere. I'm asking both for you guys and me. Has anyone heard of anything like that? The veterans.
Finals, I don't know if they thought about elections.
They should have. It's like for some reason I thought it was in the middle of the semester.
Actually, I have a love party in the NC at 5 to 7 with Ashley. You wanna come?
Excellent for Zoom and the rest of the room. If you didn't hear that word, there sounds like there's a watch party for the election tonight, the results, in real time. And where it is again? The library at the MCC. Nice. Definitely. I hope they feed you guys or do something, but, if there was a night to be together, if you're watching stuff, I'm telling myself I can't watch it in my house alone. So I gotta go somewhere and watch it with people, or I can't watch it at all if I'm home alone, which isn't so bad either. We're gonna see how it plays out. Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody there. Now I've got some notes curated on today's readings. They will kind of go into next time as well, but there's lots of things from TikTok actually that you could use on this topic. These aren't the best or the only ones. They're just ones that I resonated with, and we'll kind of touch on some of the themes here. So, because we know how the sound is here. Oh, fuck. I was like, I know it's okay, laugh. I was like, later the YouTube being full screen was bad enough, but these are tiny TikToks, but we're gonna make it work. Let's go ahead.
Connected to.
This guy going.
Connected. Ready to connect.
Battery 5. Connected to. Play
Make
Mac
sure there's nothing. Can you hear me now? Oh, and Microsoft's quit. We've got all systems meltdown. Hey, Zoomland, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? We're seeing some yeses. Yeah, sorry about that. Looks like our room is deteriorating in real time because in the past, if you know, we've had the AV issue, but it's never affected the microphone. Could be the speaker, who knows? But we're going to just all look at the slides. Let me try one more time. Let me try one more time. Just because if it was the speaker. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? You guys can hear me now? Okay. So it was the speaker. Oh. Yeah. Okay. Let's get back to this. I even had a video for you guys later. We'll probably just post it. I wanted to bring some levity to today. I guess I've done it, not in the way that I intended, but I'll at least link it. I haven't posted the one from last week. That was kind of a downer. But if later, we probably won't have time for it, but I was going to show you guys a scene for each character from Res Dogs. We'll come back to Res Dogs next week. I have to get the tech working. Indigenous resilience. We need the tech. We will prevail. Thank you guys in Zoom land for putting up with this. Oh, I was gonna say, it reminds me, not only was that professor glaring at me, but I got everything cleaned up finally. And I don't want to gender it, but I feel like he could have helped. Instead, he just watched and glared. I was like, okay, your wife must be happy. But I was playing music and all that kind of stuff, and Crazy Train by Ozzy Osbourne accidentally turned on right as I was cleaning up all the stuff. So it was kind of just too perfect. So I don't want to be like cue Crazy Train, but back to this good stuff. Oh yeah, now you want to play sounds. Fuck you, computer. Yeah. So what I was saying when Zoom couldn't hear me is that we are going to learn today about something that you may have familiarity with in your own lives. And actually, what you kind of may have gotten from the reading too is that while we're using words like the soul wound or historical trauma to describe this phenomenon, this is something that we've known on a spiritual level going back since contact. And it's now increasingly being proven how the experiences of those who came before us live in our DNA. And without addressing them, at minimum, they continue to live in our body, but can be transmitted across time through our DNA and into our bloodline. And that we ourselves we inherit a certain level of that depending on your family history. Now, they describe this phenomenon as something called the soul wound, whereby this is kind of synonymous to words like the historical trauma, historical legacy. Others have even described the Native American Holocaust or an intergenerational post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, it's not really the terms that matter, more so that it's just now that Western science is kind of acknowledging this is a thing, starting to quantify it, study it, and try and intervene, when it's something that we have had to know just by virtue of surviving kind of wave after wave of colonization. In many ways, the people who survived were still breathing, but what they were left with was an accumulation of this trauma, generation after generation. Now, it is arguably not just that something bad had happened in a historical sense, but that it is never fully mourned or grieved. That the incomplete mourning and resulting depression is actually absorbed by children from birth onward, and that the unresolved trauma is intergenerationally cumulative. So it's compounding across each generation, impacting mental health, impacting life outcomes, cognitive ability, even down to the chronic health conditions we see impacting certain communities over others, knowing increasingly that there's an epigenetic basis to those above and beyond the individual lifestyle choices of any one person is arguably where we start seeing the sociology and the psychology and the neuroscience even start to really intersect, because we know that the experiences that would accumulate in a soul wound way are not equally distributed. They're not universally experienced. And so that means that there is a disproportionate exposure to historical trauma at minimum. Now, if we think of why, you know, I say I hate this week, unlike other weeks. It's always important, I think, to have the intellectual curiosity of like, why would we study this? Why is this important? That's always a compelling question you can ask of anything. This week, it's a little different. I think in some ways it's more intuitive that this is something, whether we want to study it or not, people are dealing with, some communities more than others, some individuals more than others. And even as real as it is on a constant, like daily basis, when people from the outside look at our communities, they see the deficits, they see the outcomes, they see the unemployment, the poverty, the crime, the substance use rates. They don't appreciate the context and the degree to which this is not just a contemporary experience. And while it has to have contemporary solutions, without understanding the historical context, where do you even hope to intervene? And at worst, when you are essentially attributing what we see in modern reservations, like the negative outcomes, when you try to put that on the community as some kind of internal deficits therein, you're actually, it's a form of epistemic violence, which is going back to our early readings, looking at epistemology and like how we know things and what things we honor as real or not real, what pain we see, whose trauma we acknowledge. These are all, in one hand, scientific questions, but also questions that have like social meaning and ramifications that can be a further violence above and beyond the actual trauma taking place. Now, they actually describe how in the Indigenous case, it is actually the fact that so few people can appreciate this historical level of the contemporary circumstances, that it's almost, in their words, they feel a conspiracy of silence, that we suffer and our trauma is not acknowledged because there is actually gain in that. That if our rights in any way were acknowledged, there's other things that would have to change. And that's kind of been, I think, a running thread of this class is if this one thing were true, or we even were willing to problematize it, what else would we have to change accordingly? And it's not usually that the thing we want to change doesn't make sense or is reasonable or even better, but rather everything else that hinges on it, and how there's almost a knee-jerk response to reject anything that challenges those basic structures of power. I think it's pretty wild to be talking about this on election day, especially if you believe in astrology. I don't know if it's going to happen, but it says a lot of shit's getting upturned right now. And I don't know. I don't want to get too hopeful, but in some ways, those structures of power, when we think of the core myths they are built on, it comes down to, oops, my screen share went away. Are you guys still seeing the screen? Zoomland? That was weird. Share. Okay, I hope on Zoomland you guys are still seeing it. Okay, anyway, back to this. Now they offer different quantitative and qualitative evidence to their points, and they show how what's unfortunate is if we think of this conspiracy of silence and kind of settler colonialism, not really having a vested interest in this being a story that's told, that is in many ways a backdrop. But if we actually try to think of the maybe more logistical difficulties to establishing historical trauma as real, there's also just methodological concerns. If we think about social science and methodologies broadly speaking, in many cases, right, especially with mental health, especially with things that would look at trauma or brains, that randomized controlled trials, that RCT, that's like the gold standard, especially if you're trying to prove A causes B, right? Now, if that were the case, like you can't really expect there to be a randomized controlled trial for trauma. Ethically speaking, even if once upon a time someone may have wanted to try and do that, that's not anything anyone could do now or study now. And so the trauma we see, it's never randomly distributed. It's never something that we can also look at in the counterfactual. There's no Blythe George who's not traumatized. Darkly speaking, when we think of the ways science, social science, brain science often seeks to prove things, trauma itself is almost slippery because it can't be held to those same standards, either for ethical reasons or just for, I was like, I don't know, timeline and dimension reasons. There's no way to have two Blythes, one who experiences it and one who doesn't. And I make that example. Does anyone know, has anyone heard of the counterfactual? Anyone here taking a stats class? Even if you haven't heard of it? Seeing some no, it's okay. I try to, I talk to people, I interview, but those things matter. And they're often seen as the empirical gold standard. In some ways, that's where we are written off, is even though it's real to us and it's so real, it's literally life or death. How do we prove that? How do you prove historical trauma or its effects? In some ways, I think the authors and even myself and people in our communities would say, why do I have to? Why do I have to prove something that I know to be true? And do we need to prove it to start intervening in it? Obviously, I've chosen to study things, so I think there's some merit in proving it. Not proving it's the wrong word. I actually think our ability to address it hinges on our ability to know what's going on. So at the very least, understanding process and mechanisms. Excuse me. But you don't need a degree to know about historical trauma. In most ways, science itself is still catching up to what our aunties, our grandmas, our uncles, and the aunties and uncles and grandmas who came before them all knew. That old knowledge about the soul wound is no less important than it was now than it was then, or then than it was now. But we now are finally, we have the tools, the science is catching up to what does this look like on a DNA level? What does this look like on intergenerational level? How is it that someone could be impacted by something so severely that they themselves never directly experienced? Excuse me. Now, this brings us to the idea of the survivor's child complex. Now, this is something that actually came, memory serves, through studying people descended from Holocaust survivors. That they're essentially their parents, either as really little children, young adults, whatever life course exposure they had lived through the Holocaust, and they were quantifying the effects on the generation born to those people. Now, they saw in that generation that depression, suicidal ideation and behavior, guilt and concern about betraying the ancestors was kind of, they almost, by being excluded from their suffering, there was a betrayal. And so there was an internalized obligation to share in ancestral pain. Now, this wasn't just obviously depression, suicidal ideation and behavior. These are very real outcomes. When it comes to guilt, concern, shame, these are less straightforward to quantify, but at minimum, we know that they're living, again, in the body. Vander Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, The Body Keeps the Store, that would be cool. It's 10 years old now, which is wild. I was like, I'm pretty sure I have some cool clips to show next time, maybe. But when we're having this discussion, it's because we both want to validate the experiences of a historical trauma, both past and present, but we also, more importantly, arguably, want to find a way to intervene into things like substance use patterns, as well as diabetes, violence, suicide, all of these being different kind of chronic mental and physical byproducts of this accumulation of trauma. And as you guys learn in this week's resources, that not only do our own bodies, right, accumulate markers of the things we've lived through, and we're kind of our DNA is shaped by the things our ancestors lived through, but did you guys know that we were all in our grandmother's womb and she in hers? How? Has anyone heard of that before? Even if you just learned it, how would that even be possible? I've seen this on TikTok. In fact, I have a TikTok. We probably won't be able to watch it. How would this happen? Let me see anything in the chat. Go ahead.
This is good, but I know female body people are born with like all the pieces now, so that if you're gonna have children, you're born with your children.
Mm-hmm. Yes. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. Because even though on a cellular level, you are one egg inside the fetus that will become your mother, everything that that fetus experiences is shaped by what your grandma is experiencing. And I mean, honestly, the more you learn, I was like, the more you learn about all the things that can impact a child before they even take their first breath, it can almost be startling and scary because you're like, shit, I thought I'd get a chance to fuck them up. Turns out if I'm having bad thoughts and like just road rage in utero, they could be cooking them angry. Now I know what happened to me. But the beyond just the like, blowing your mind level of it, it's also a very real biological process by which we're seeing the experiences accumulate. And in this case, people, whether it's the Holocaust, whether it's Native American genocide, sometimes there are people, not in this class, I'm sure, but people will say, it's so long ago. Why don't you just get over it? It's so long ago. Well, when you count it that way, when you count it grandma to grandma, things are a lot more prescient in time, if that's how you put it, then if you were just counting generationally speaking. The things that happened to my grandmother in a very real way impacted me from my first days and before that. And that means that the things she experienced while she was in utero impacted her. And like I said, when you count grandmother to grandmother, those historical things, you can see how it would have an impact. Go ahead.
I read a thing, it was, it might have been a TikTok, but basically, it was about like the great grandmother, like being pregnant, but being famished,
Mm-hmm.
and then like going forth, like to the next like woman in the family, like
Mm-hmm.
the next woman in the family, like keeps the nutrients and like the fats in their body, and it's like not necessarily that like they have poor health, but their bodies are keeping in
Mm-hmm.
the nutrients and fats because they think that like the body is going to be famished again, like the great grandmother was.
Yes.
So it could be like, today, a young woman like my age could be, looks like she's overweight or obese, but like really you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
That story.
Mhm.
It could be genetic. It's not actually living her life. Like,
Mhm.
it's just that's how it went down. From
Mhm.
great grandma was Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
Body had to like save itself.
Yes, I want to say the Irish potato famine, and then also for those who survived the Holocaust, essentially by hiding in plain sight, Audrey Hepburn being one of the most public cases. You guys know Breakfast at Tiffany's. It's an older movie, but the woman who's in that, she's very petite. I don't want to be like, even if you don't know her name, if you think of Marilyn Monroe or like the archetypal white women of history, the tiniest one, Audrey Hepburn, was very just a tiny person her whole life. And she was always very vocal about how they had lived. I think it was in Belgium maybe, or the Netherlands, but they survived eating the bulbs of tulips because there was, if you were behind enemy lines, you were hiding, you weren't going for food, nothing. And so what's wild about those studies is that they were actually showing how there were metabolic changes on the next generation from only one generation's experience of extreme famine. And why that matters is you're seeing something that, not to say like famine, trauma is worse than famine, but arguably famine could be worse. Something could be worse. Famine itself not only could be detected to the next generation, but actually one of the hardest things to impact in like a human biological sense is the metabolic rate. That's why bariatric surgeries and was it the semaglutides? That's why those are very interesting phenomena, because one of the hardest and most like locked in patterns our body does is metabolic rate. That's just is what it is. So the idea that an extreme famine could impact one of the most like set in, like we could spend our whole lives trying to impact our metabolic rate, but a famine experience in our bloodline could shape our metabolic rate above and beyond any choices we ever make. This isn't hopefully news to you, but it's giving you maybe some teeth to things that you've been exposed to out in the world. I think much like the gender stuff, like you guys are, hopefully you should have a therapist. If you don't, it's cool. It's always been cool. If I could go back in time, that's the one thing I do different is I go to therapy when I had it for free as a student, instead of being too afraid to hear what they were going to say and just thinking I could tough it out on my own. A lot of that came from, if you don't know, you don't know. And even though we all have our own personal experiences that, you can work out in therapy, you have to also be able to orient it within this historical and contextual layer. And in some ways, I hope this kind of rings a bell to the sociological imagination that we touched on earlier this semester, because even though it'd be really easy to take some of this and be like, well, shit, I'm fucked from the jump because I know how it was for mom and grandma and all the way back. As one of those TikToks said, we know that these things can accumulate on an epigenetic and a neurological level, but we also know that in our own lifetimes, we can heal these things. We can make changes to them such that our children or anyone whose DNA comes from us does not have those same impacts, which is wild. It's, kind of sucks to think you didn't get to pick. Sometimes darkly, I think if mom had done it, who knows where I'd be. But if you do it, at minimum, it stops here. And it's almost a superpower to think that there's something in you that has lived for hundreds of years, maybe, but it stops with you and the hard work that you do in this lifetime. And you're young still. Do it while you're young and supple. Now, when we are continuing to kind of trace these impacts over time, much like the impacts on metabolic rate from the famine generations, you see that people who back to the survivor child's complex, that in some ways survivors feared the uncontrollable rage locked within them. They feared they'd be devoured by thoughts of avenging the deaths of their loved ones. So these repressions result in a psychic numbing. So it's not unreasonable and it's not illogical that in previous generations, these things had to be put away. Because if you think of what we know about survival mode and processing, there's so many things that like your brain can't even think about before it gets its basic needs met and it has some sense of safety. So whether it's fair or not, you can appreciate why perhaps previous generations psychically numbed and dealt with things in the way they did. It's often the case that sometimes we kind of draw lines between people who use and people who don't. instead of appreciating that no one gets to pick their trauma response. And in a lot of ways, fight, flight, fawn, freeze, these are our animal brain. And in conditions of extreme stress, finding ways to cope is actually the most rational thing. And in some ways, our ability to feel anger and to feel hurt and to feel grief is a direct reflection of the safety that our generation has access to, at least compared to those who've come before us. Now, if you decide maybe just to white knuckle it, that's not exactly gonna work out. Let's say I don't want to deal with it. These, I wanted to point out too, these are all Native American psychologists for the most part. And so a lot of their examples are drawing from working with people in clinical capacities. And they talk about how often many of their clients kind of completely denied or shut down their emotions because if they came up, anger is what would come up, extreme anger, in fact. And that anger manifested externally or internally, there would be a resulting need for an anesthetic self-intervention, whether that's alcohol abuse, drug abuse, domestic violence, or suicide. Because again, your brain is seeking something to soothe itself. And if we think of rational actors or the things people do being some, we're always, not we, I'm saying economists or rational actors. The idea is that people do things that make sense to optimize their given goals or outcomes in a given moment. If your given outcome is just to stay alive and not lose it, your coping mechanisms might not be conducive to other goals, getting out, going to college, raising a healthy family. It's not that people don't want to do these other things, but rather in the context of extreme trauma, historical trauma, and then your own individual experiences of trauma, what are you supposed to do? I don't want this to be a downer, but I hope we can at least give some grace to people who maybe dealt with their traumas differently. I often, when I was young, I might have drawn lines between the way my brother and I coped. And then I came across the book, Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Children, or Emotionally Immature Adults. They are kind of children inside. Read it. It's way good. Read it in little bits. It's a fucking up your day kind of book. But they talk about externalizers and internalizers. And once I learned more about that, I realized in some ways I had just been lucky that my drug of choice, work, was sanctioned by capitalism, that I could escape in a workaholic way that would be rewarded because I was the internalizer. He had a different path, but you can't say either of us chose it because these are coping mechanisms that come up from the animal brain before you even get a chance, when you're little and then you're a teen and then adulthood. In many ways, part of mental health when it comes to trauma, either personal or historical, is getting enough information to appreciate like, okay, this is how I move in a given scenario. Is it because that's how I want to move, like on a personal level, or is it because that's just what I've always seen? That's the reaction and the reflex that I've been taught to have. If it lines up with how you want to move in the world, then you don't have to do anything. But if you start finding inconsistencies with how you want to show up and how you are showing up, you can kind of hold space for why coping in certain ways has come to be. And cut yourself some slack, but also find ways to intervene. Next time, we're going to talk more about what that looks like on an individual level. But ultimately, we are having to reckon with the fact that Western approaches focus on illness and pathology. They don't really consider community assets. And so when we are trying to address historical trauma or PTSD or any of these things, it's often very difficult for Indigenous people, or I would say even BIPOC patients, broadly speaking, because there is a Western modality in a great majority of mental health provision. It can feel not like a good fit for many reasons, but in some ways it's almost because there is a victim blaming or a inability to see the strengths that you come with by virtue of coming from your community as well. That there is almost, I mean, I'm, like I said, I'm in therapy too. And sometimes I'm like, God, you know, don't get me wrong, no contact sounds juicy. I've considered it, you know, but that doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem culturally congruent, and it doesn't seem fair when I know the only reason mom acts a fool is because it goes way back. Where are those tools to hold space for what our families have experienced while also letting ourselves have our own lives and things like that? That's the front lines. That's the fringe. We don't have enough people in mental health practitioners, let alone people of color studying these things. But at minimum, these authors offer that without acknowledging the strengths of the Native American family structures and including them into therapy or other forms of intervention, there's always going to be resistance because it's operating within a system of a pathologized self, that you are doing this because there's something wrong with you. That's it. Doesn't, you know, pick what's wrong with you, insert whatever condition, whatever disorder, but it's a you problem, not a historical legacy, not a historical trauma, not something you have the misfortune of having to deal with if you want to live, and the privilege to have access to if you want to live. Like both these things go together, but there's not a lot of resources for it. And I'm sure you noticed the article itself, it's pretty old. In a couple of years, it'll be 30 years old. So we are going to offer a couple more recent things soon, next time. But I'm going to call it today. Today's one of those days. I just want to run out of my skin. I hope you guys stay safe wherever you're at. I will put up the link later just for brevity's sake, if you want a little cool res dogs. And yeah, I'll take this time to see what the tech people can do for us. At the very least, they'll come and they'll be with us next time. Always fun. Yeah. So if you mean the quiz from last week, let me do Zoom real quick. Hi, Zoom land. We are finishing up. If you have questions, you can hang out afterwards. But otherwise, you're free to go. We're ending early today. I'm all out of content, and I think we can take the day. Thanks, everybody. So if it's the quiz from last week, no one's gotten it yet. But if you dressed up, but if you were on Zoom, everyone takes the quiz if it's on Zoom. So you'll see the quiz today. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Awesome. I'm seeing a couple of people on Zoom. If you're here for help, I've got a couple of people in the room to clear first. If you just don't know I've said bye, I'm going to turn the Zoom off shortly. But let me know in the chat if you need anything from me. I'm going to go on mute though for privacy.